Thanks everyone for coming. This is the second session. This afternoon we have actually two more sessions tomorrow morning starting at 9 a.m. Same place. So far we've had some really good papers and discussion. I'm very pleased with the intellectual interaction. This afternoon the session is going to be moderated by my wonderful colleague Louise Newman, who does American Women's History here at the University of Florida.
Thank you. So thank you all for coming. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce to you our speaker for today. So I was going to say, I've been hired. I've been here since the 90s teaching U.S. women's history, but I teach less and less of it now, which is something I thought maybe we would discuss at some point. I know there was a beginning part of that discussion, but it's still the subject closest to my heart. So I'm really honored, Bill, that you asked me to do one of these introductions. So Dr. Melissa Walker is Emerita George Dean Johnson Jr. Chair in History at Converse College, where she has taught for over 21 years, although she's just recently retired. After earning her PhD in U.S. and women's history, she went directly to Converse, I take it, and spent her entire career there. She's an award-winning teacher and scholar. She was recognized in 2007 as the South Carolina Professor of the Year by the Carnegie Foundation for Teaching and the Council for the Advancement Support of Education, in recognition for the work that she had done at Converse. And she has also received the O'Haran Award for Faculty Excellence and the Catherine Amelia Brown Award for Outstanding Teaching. She's also an equally renowned scholar. So her first book, All We Knew Was to Farm, Rural Women in the Up County South, 1919 to 1945, received the Willie Lee Rose Prize from the Southern Association for Women Historians. And she has subsequently published 9 more books as either author or editor, and numerous journal articles. She served as the president of the Southern Association for Women Historians and as the president for the Agricultural History Society, and she's also served on the executive council of the Southern Historical Association. So in 2016, and these are her words, she entered a new season in her career when she decided to focus on coaching women through transitional periods in their lives. And she told me just before I came up to do the introduction that most of her clients have some sort of academic connection, but she coaches women of all ages and from all walks of life. And specializing, of course, in academic clients. And the name, she's president and founder of her own coaching company. It's called Heyday Coaching, to which she brings, of course, more than 30 years experience in coaching, mentoring, and teaching. She attained training for coaching from the Mentor Coach, which is an accredited program of the International Coaching Federation. And she's launched this company, Heyday Coaching, dedicated to helping clients achieve their personal heydays. She's, let me also say, this wasn't in the bio that she originally gave me, but I want to say it anyway, that she has a TEDx talk. So those of us who like listening to TEDx talks, there's one that you can access and hear. And she also, and I have great admiration for this, she won 2 NEH Landmark in American History grants, which allowed her to teach teachers. So she taught K-12 teachers on the American Revolution in the Southern backcountry. And we shared together just now that this has been some of the best teaching we've ever done. Both of us love teaching teachers of history. So without any further ado, she's here to talk to us. Today, her talk is titled, A Place Where Women Can Feel Valued.
Thank you.
That's okay.
Thank you so much, Louise, for that introduction. And I want to thank Bill Link for inviting us here and making this opportunity available. It's been a wonderful gathering. I want to thank David. David, we were talking about transferable skills today, and you've amassed a number of them in working on this conference. There are so many people in this room that have had a major role in my career. Michelle Gillespie has been a mentor of mine since I took over being the executive secretary of the SAWH from her in 2000. But of course, probably the most instrumental person in my career is Catherine Clinton. Catherine is the reason I came to the SAWH. She was a visiting scholar at a neighboring institution in I guess this would have been in 1999, and she sought me out and she said, I have a great opportunity for you. And it turned out to be a great opportunity. For me, the SAWH was a really formative part of my career, especially because I was in a small department. I was in a department of 5 people, and it was a combined history and politics department. And I was basically the Americanist. And I didn't have a lot of colleagues who did what I did. I went to graduate school in New England in a small program, so I didn't have a lot of graduate student cohorts out in the field. And I felt pretty isolated as a historian. And so the SAWH offered me a network that really transformed my career. And I owe that to Catherine Clinton, so thank you. My talk is called A Place Where Women Can Feel Valued, and as these things often do, this talk evolved and went in a different direction than I thought it would, even as I had written the abstract. Because the subtitle of this talk now is Why Academic Professional Associations Matter, Especially to Women. In 2003, historian Elizabeth Jacoway told an interviewer, I think that the fact that the SAWH is so wildly successful speaks to the need women feel to have a place where they can go and feel that they are valued. As Jacoway suggests, the SAWH provided a place where female historians felt validated and encouraged. And by providing this space, the SAWH has done important things, especially advancing the careers of individual female historians and encouraging, developing, and legitimizing the study of women's history. And in the process, as several of the scholars here have suggested, the SAWH has helped to transform the historiography of the American South by refocusing many of the lenses that scholars have trained on the past. The history of the SAWH demonstrates the crucial role that scholarly professional associations play in shaping fields of knowledge and the careers of individual scholars. And I can read my large print, but I can't read my little notes without my glasses. In fact, as I worked on this paper, I really came to appreciate how much professional associations matter. So I'll start with a really condensed overview of the role of professional associations in American professions throughout our history. And then I'll talk about some of the forces inside and outside the academy, including second wave feminism that sparked the formation of the SAWH. And finally, I'll offer testimony about the role the SAWH played in nurturing the careers of female historians and the study of Southern women's history. Professionalization is the social process by which people practicing a particular occupation set standards for best practices which differentiate between qualified and unqualified practitioners. And in the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the United States, professional associations became the collective gatekeepers, which developed the acceptable qualifications for entry into the profession, oversaw the conduct of members, and legitimized currents of knowledge development within those fields. Professionalization took root first in American law and medicine in the middle decades of the 19th century. And by the early 20th century, American universities had also begun to embrace this culture of professionalism. Graduate programs became the entree to college faculty positions. Believe it or not, that was not always the case in the early 19th century. And academics, like members of other professions, advanced their careers through involvement in professional organizations, which became essential vehicles for professional advancement. Scholarship from the management literature broadens our understanding of some of the reasons that professional associations were so crucial for professional advancement. In her path-breaking 1977 study of gender dynamics in the corporate world, Harvard management professor Rosabeth Moss-Cantor found that informal professional networks were as essential to individual advancement as formal hierarchies, whether those informal networks were within the organization or outside it. And particularly important in these informal hierarchies were sponsors. We would call them mentors in some ways. Sponsors were people who wielded power in a profession and used that power to advocate for promising younger professionals, providing them with insider information and advice that advanced their careers and helping them make important connections. Cantor noted that sponsors were more essential for women than men because of women's already disadvantaged place in the workforce. Nonetheless, women found it harder to find sponsors in male-dominated professions. Certainly, stories of how the academic job market worked in the old days, when male graduate advisors picked up the phone and contacted members of their own professional associations to secure jobs for promising male protégés, suggests that sponsorship was just as important in the historical profession as in a corporation. Cantor also noted that strong alliances among peers helped advance careers, because peers could exchange favors, share knowledge and ideas, and again, help people make important connections. Academic professional associations could be really fertile ground for cultivating these peer networks. From their 19th century beginnings, professional associations usually sought to exclude African Americans and women. Black professionals of both sexes faced ostracism and discrimination from white professionals, and black women, by the way, faced discrimination from black men within separate professional associations. But Darlene Clark Hine has done some particularly good work on the way black professionals built and nurtured their own organizations for professional advancement. Like African Americans, in the late 19th century, white professional women began to form their own associations. Female physicians founded women's medical societies, which aimed to publicize discrimination against women doctors, exert pressure on the male medical establishment to include women, and they networked with other female physicians, informed women of new job opportunities, and touted the professional achievements of female physicians. Female medical associations often established their own journals to publish clinical studies by women that couldn't get published in the male-dominated journals. By the 1890s, female lawyers and women in academic science pursued a similar strategy, forming separate associations and publishing their own proceedings. Thus, by the late 19th century, professional associations had emerged as essential institutions in setting and maintaining professional standards in most fields, nurturing new generations of professionals, and shaping the trends in each profession. And particularly in academia, where young professionals competed on a national job market and among national publishing houses and scholarly journals for opportunities, professional associations provided the access to sponsors and peer allies that were essential to advancement. For academic women then, lack of access to full participation and leadership roles in professional associations was a major obstacle. This all brings us to the world of historians. In the middle decades of the 19th century, before professionalization, a number of American women had gained prominence and indeed made a living as prolific and respected writers of history. These included Martha Lamb, who published the Magazine of American History, Elizabeth Elliot, a chronicler of women's contributions to the American Revolution, and Alice Earle, who wrote about the history of women and domestic life. As the study of and writing of history was slowly transformed into a profession requiring advanced degrees and participation in national professional associations, women like Lamb, Elliot, and Earle were marginalized. Women who aspired to become historians were barred from entrance to many universities, particularly to graduate programs, and denied most faculty positions. And even women who did enjoy some success as historians found that they could only find acceptance by focusing their scholarly lenses on history as made by men, in sharp contrast to women like Elizabeth Elliot, who had developed a viable career writing about women. Historians Panina Migdal-Glaser and Miriam Slater found that women who earned master's degrees and PhDs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were disproportionately clustered on the faculties of women's colleges. In a case study of the Mount Holyoke College History Department, Glaser and Slater found that the women historians had that none of these women historians at Mount Holyoke had benefited from strong support from male mentors. They studied with men, but these men were not huge cheerleaders or supporters. Also, these women, while they were well aware of their distinctive experience as female scholars, they seldom translated this awareness of their gendered experience into a set of scholarly questions about the past. Indeed, female historians resisted efforts to use gender as a category of historical analysis or to examine women's experience as distinctive from men. They focused almost exclusively on male historical actors. Starting around 1930, the numbers of women pursuing scholarly careers began to diminish. Women's colleges also faced diminishing status, in part because of the rise of the research university, which really became the ideal in higher education in the post-World War II period. Women had never found wide acceptance as faculty members in research universities, and they found it difficult to capitalize on the post-war expansion in faculty opportunities there. Meanwhile, a lot of women's colleges were finding it much, much harder to compete and facing a lot of financial constraints, and they couldn't form the doctoral programs which might have boosted their own standing. Finally, as the number of women earning PhDs declined, more men became faculty members at women's colleges. And this is certainly true if you look at my own institution in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. Most of the faculty members were men. So the number of women on faculties declined in both raw numbers and in proportion from the 1930s to the 1950s. In addition to the structural obstacles, and I talk more about this in the longer work, I would suggest that the challenges of finding mentors who could open doors to professional opportunities was a major obstacle in maintaining the momentum of women's entry into the professions. As Glaser and Slater noted, even among the savvy women at Mount Holyoke, quote, seldom were they able to secure their hard-won places for future generations. Lacking access to the structures that could facilitate their careers, each generation of women had to start anew. By contrast, their male counterparts provided growing opportunities and institutionalized patronage practices for younger men through mentor relationships and informal informational networks, as well as through the formal powers of selection they held in high administrative posts. Female historians living and working in the South had similar difficulties gaining support from male mentors or networks. In her book, Unheard Voices, The First Historians of Southern Women, Anne Fearer Scott profiles 5 women historians born in Southern states between 1895 and 1903. They all produced path-breaking work in Southern social history and all became practicing historians, but as she said, not one achieved a recognized position in the historical profession, and their work lay unnoticed almost for decades. In spite of their distinguished work, none benefited from robust support from male mentors. One example was Virginia Gerhardt Gray, who earned a PhD at University of Wisconsin in 1928 under the guidance of 3 well-respected male historians, who enthusiastically endorsed her for a dissertation fellowship, which was a study of the work of antebellum white women to get passage of married women's property laws and their work in voluntary associations. Scott notes, quote, given that all 3 of her mentors were men, active and well-connected in the discipline, one would expect to find that in no very long time she would have been asked to appear on scholarly programs and that her work would have been incorporated into surveys of Southern history. This was not the case, however. Scott points out that the work these women pursued, with its focus on women and non-elite populations, was in a field that male historians simply did not recognize. In Cleo's Southern Sisters, which Connie Schultz talked about earlier today, Scott noted that the male historians who dominated the OAH and the SHA in the first 3 quarters of the 20th century were, quote, so sweet, so generous, so Southern gentlemanly, and so impervious. They truly treated individual people with great courtesy and always acted as if you were absolutely wonderful, but they wouldn't read what you wrote. women confronted a similar lack of interest in women's history among editors of scholarly journals. When A. Elizabeth Taylor submitted an article on the suffrage movement in Tennessee to the Tennessee Historical Quarterly, she was told, "We think an article of this type is better suited to the League of Women Voters publication or the AAUW." She said, quote, "On programs, the subject of women's history was always a handicap because I was told, we don't have anything to pair yours with." Even some women resisted studying women's history. They told her, "I wouldn't want to be identified with a subject about women. That's just poison." They thought I put myself at a disadvantage by studying women's history. Women's historians had long sought full participation in major professional associations. Catherine Kish-Sklar has found that a few early women historians managed to participate at high levels in a number of associations, most notably Louise Kellogg, who was elected president of the Mississippi Valley Historical Association, which is now the OAH. And in 1946, the Southern finally elected a woman president, Ella Lon from Goucher College. Nonetheless, Lon and Kellogg were exceptional. In the first two-thirds of the 20th century, few women advanced to leadership roles in professional associations in the historical profession, and few were able to publish in major historical journals. A further obstacle to women achieving equal status in professional associations was the context in which much of the organizational business was conducted. And I know that there are people in the room who actually remember this. Much of the networking at places like the Southern Historical Association took place in all-male gatherings called smokers, where women were not welcome. Thus, women were not included in the informal networks that often led to exchanges of information about job opportunities, funding, publication venues, and the kinds of sponsorship that Cantor talked about. Separate professional associations for women historians were born of this marginalization. The first of the separate professional associations for women historians, of course, was the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, which grew out of a gathering of women in Lakeville, Connecticut in 1930. For many years, the Berkshire Conference remained a small group, primarily filled with women from the Northeast, who gathered annually. But they did not focus on women's history. They focused broadly on basically any discipline. Not until 1968 did they undertake any kind of activism. At that year, in the wake of second wave feminism, the organization began to offer book prizes for outstanding scholarship by women. In 1973, it held its first conference on women's history, and that's when the organization, the Berkshire Conference, began to focus on women and gender studies, which is where its focus remains today. As the history of the Berkshire Conference suggests, it would take the great social ferment that engulfed the nation in the 60s and 70s to launch a grassroots movement for women's equality within the historical profession. A new women's movement dominated by middle-class women who aspired to professional careers emerged, and a number of legal milestones like the Equal Pay Act of 1963 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act opened the door to eliminating sex discrimination in employment. Now notice I said opened the door, I didn't say it did eliminate discrimination. The formation of women's rights groups like NOW, as well as women's work in the civil rights movement, meant that a lot of young female historians had experience with grassroots activism. And that second wave feminist activism had focused on consciousness raising, which was intended to increase awareness of social and structural obstacles to women's achievement. That unleashed a wave of women's discontent with the status quo. And finally, the youth movements of the era gave rise to demands from college students to broaden both the structures and the content of the curriculum, to include women's, Black, and ethnic studies, and also to include women and people of color on faculties. So that would fuel demand for a more inclusive curriculum and faculty in history departments. By the early 1970s, women were pursuing PhDs in numbers not seen since the 1920s. But women who earned doctorates were frustrated because the structure of professional life still disadvantaged them. Increasing numbers of women were joining the historical professional organizations, but they rarely ascended to leadership positions, and they felt shunted off into their own track of jobs, and often part-time jobs. In oral history interviews and autobiographical essays, a number of early leaders of the SAWH reflected on the obstacles facing female historians who entered the profession in the 60s and 70s. Margaret Ripley Wolfe recalled, "It would never have occurred to any of the men I dealt with at my graduate program or in my department as a faculty member to encourage me to attend a professional meeting." Molly C. Davis said, "I think that women in particular weren't taught by their mentors or anyone how to make a contract, and everything was so secret, everything about the job market." Frustrated that the American Historical Association seemed committed to preserving male dominance, at the 1969 AHA meeting, a group of women came together to form the Coordinating Committee on Women in the Historical Profession. CCWHP was formed to encourage the recruitment of women into the profession, to oppose discrimination against women in the profession, and to encourage research and instruction in women's history. Molly Davis, later a founding member of the SAWH, was a founding officer of CCWHP while she was still a graduate student. She was a grassroots activist all her life, and she brought that activist sensibility to her work as a historian. And she recalled that the CCWHP really helped women begin to get a foothold in the AHA. She said the CCWHP helped open up positions for many of us, and she went on to talk about committee roles that they were able to secure because of the pressure that was brought to bear by CCWHP. Women were also frustrated by their marginalization within the SHA. As Constance Schultz and Elizabeth Hayes Turner noted in the introduction to Cleo's Southern Sisters, quote, "Before 1970, women historians in the South could turn to few role models for professional guidance within the SHA. In 1970, 30 of these frustrated women, as you've already heard today, came together at the annual meeting of the SHA to form a loose coalition called the Caucus of Women Historians. One of the women present in Louisville, Barbara Brandon Schnorenberg, summed up the goals of the founding members. She said, "One was to encourage interest in panels and programs on women's history, and the other was to get more women onto committees and power positions at the SHA." The loosely organized Caucus of Women Historians grew over the next decade and a half. By 1985, it had renamed itself the Southern Association for Women Historians and opened membership to all historians, male or female, inside or outside the South, who supported its mission of advancing women in the profession and promoting the study of Southern women's history. As the SAWH grew from an informal caucus of women working on the edges of the SHA to a well-organized professional group offering a broad range of member services, the organization's leaders not only sought to advance the careers of its members, but they took important steps to encourage and validate the study of women's history. For example, most historical organizations, as you've already heard, celebrate the induction of a new president by having that scholar present an annual address, but the SAWH took a different approach, asking a leading scholar of women's history to give this annual lecture, thus institutionalizing the idea of professional female historians advancing the careers of other female historians. And as Charisse hinted at, she was one of those women presenting one of those presidential addresses at the SHA. Because these lectures were given at the SHA and followed by a gala reception, they tended to attract a large audience. The SAWH had a reputation of giving the best parties at the SHA. And this helped to highlight and make visible the work, the really outstanding work that was being done on Southern women's history and promote its acceptance. The organization also used book prizes as a way to advance the careers of female scholars and encourage the study of women's history. In the late 1980s, the SAWH raised funds to establish 2 book prizes, the Julia Cherry Spruill Prize for the Best Book in Southern Women's History, and the Willie Lee Rose Prize for the Best Book in Southern History authored by a woman. And later they would add the A. Elizabeth Taylor Prize for the Best Article on Southern Women's History and the Jacqueline Dowd Hall Prizes for the Best Papers presented by graduate students at the Triennial Conference. By presenting most of these prizes at the annual address, again, they're increasing the visibility of scholarship on women's history. Seeking to further expand the opportunities for scholars studying women's history to share their work and exchange ideas, and inspired in part by the example of the Berkshire Conference, the SAWH, as you've already heard, organized its first Southern Conference on Women's History at Converse College in 1988. And that first conference attracted about 400 people, provoking lively conversations about historiography, research, and the challenges of studying and writing women's history, which led to a whole series of triennial conferences. Many scholars found that first conference to be career-changing. Elizabeth Hayes Turner recalled that she attended that conference as a graduate student at Rice. She said, "It was a glorious meeting of historians discovering the complexity of Southern women's history. I really thought that this association was an intellectual home, a stimulus for further work, and an organization that fostered and encouraged students. The first conference and subsequent conferences offered opportunities to meet well-established women's historians and young scholars with similar projects who spoke with enthusiasm about women's history and their findings. I left that first meeting with euphoria and the notion that a group of like-minded scholars had found one another. It was indeed life-changing." Informal conversations at the first conference highlighted the fact that women's history scholars struggled to find publication opportunities. So, as you've already heard, the SAWH leaders decided to collect, edit, and publish the best papers from the conference, negotiating with the University of Missouri Press to publish an ongoing Southern Women's History series, which eventually included 9 volumes. In 1995, historian Betty Brandon explained that the opportunities created by the SAWH to present and publish research on Southern women's history, quote, had ripple effects. She said, "When there is some interest in and the activities encourage and promote that interest, that just gives opportunities all over the place." By 1990, SAWH membership had grown to over 400, and as the organization expanded, the leadership poured considerable energy into nurturing graduate students, and they still do this. They see that as the future of the organization. They included a graduate representative on the council and intentionally developed mentoring opportunities for graduate students and junior scholars by organizing workshops and networking events for grad students and at the SHA and triennial meetings, and creating formal mechanisms to pair senior scholar mentors with junior scholars seeking advice and support. The organization developed a mentoring toolkit, which is an online collection of advice on topics ranging from navigating the job search and grants and fellowships to minority faculty issues, and that is still out there and still very useful. I would urge you to take a look at it. Even the men in the room, I would urge you to take a look at it. It's a great resource. And in the early 2000s, SAWH established a research fellowship for mid-career scholars. SAWH members were sponsors introducing their own graduate students to the organization. For example, historian Karen L. Cox recalled that her advisor Marjorie Spruill gave her a gift membership and took a group of grad students to the 3rd Triennial Conference at Rice in 1994. Graduate students spoke of finding a supportive network among SAWH members. Angela Boswell said, "I want to stress the importance of the organization at providing role models. I was in a program with an incredibly supportive advisor who encouraged and nurtured my research on women's topics. But he was a man, as were most of the faculty in the department. As a result, in my first year, I had a little trouble imagining myself as a historian. The SAWH, however, gave me a host of women with whom to network, share interests in the discipline, and most importantly, to see as active, successful historians. I doubt I would have made it through the PhD program without those examples. Without the organization, I would have attended the SHA, but the smaller number of women amongst the large sea of men, and she was talking about the 90s, the gender balance at the SHA looks much different today. But the smaller number of women amongst the large sea of men would have been lost on me. With the organization, at SAWH business meetings, at annual addresses, and at triennial conferences, I could see what I might become. Lori Glover noted that she joined the SAWH as a graduate student and, quote, "The leaders of the organization took my work seriously when I was struggling to think of myself as a historian rather than a student. SAWH at the SHA was the place I felt most comfortable randomly introducing myself to people, and the SAWH conferences became my first professional home. I quickly came to see that the culture was inclusive and gracious. I was encouraged to volunteer, and my volunteering was taken seriously too. To me, the formal organizational matters, the committees, the breakfasts, the working groups at the triennial conferences, are manifestations of a deeper cultural tradition of women working for and with women for the good of our profession. The SAWH also welcomed supportive men into its ranks, and some of these men became sponsors in a way. For example, Elizabeth Hayes Turner said, "When I entered graduate school at Rice, I introduced the SAWH to John Bowles, who quickly became a member. Through his involvement in the SAWH, the editor of the Journal of Southern History, as you've already heard, became acquainted with the burgeoning field of Southern women's history. And in future years, the work of many SAWH members would find a place in the pages of the JSH. SAWH members repeatedly cite the peer mentoring that Rosabeth Moss Cantor talked about as a benefit of SAWH membership. Karen Cox said, "Those individuals I met at my first conference at Rice are still friends that I seek out whenever I attend the SHA or the SAWH. Over the years, they've provided a sounding board about writing, publishing, etc., as I have to them." Darlene Clark Hine said that another important role of the SAWH was to provide skill training. She said, "I'm talking about leadership skills, exposure to ease the path into the larger organizational structure. Also, being an organized body, we are able to identify those women with talents and suggest them to the nominating committee and other positions, such as book prize committees, so that they can become more integrally involved with the Southern. Indeed, hundreds of women who honed leadership skills in the SAWH have gone on to serve the SHA on committees and as officers, including past presidents Carol Blesser, Catherine Clinton, Theda Perdue, and Jane Turner Simpson, to name a few. The work of feminist scholars in organizations like the SAWH would also begin to change the attitude that women's history was somehow apart from and less than other historical specialties. Stephanie Cole has explored the ways that the work of SAWH members has done that. And she argues that this has not only helped transform understandings of Southern history, but also U.S. history as a whole. The work of these female historians has shown how attention to matters of gender complicates our notion of progress and challenges the idea of the monolithic category of Southern women or even a monolithic Southern white woman. And they highlighted the importance of individual agency and uncovered the idea of overlapping identities, which of course we talk about today as intersectionality. These feminist scholars have shown how gender ideology can be used to unite or divide various groups of people. Darlene Clark has also noted that the work of Black women historians in and outside the SAWH has forced historians to ask many new questions, employ new fields of research, new methods of research and analysis, and to create new conceptual categories, all of which things are things we've talked about today. Over the almost 50 years of its existence, the SAWH has indeed provided a place where, as Betsy Jacoway said, women could feel that they are valued. The organization provided women historians with opportunities to hone leadership skills, exchange scholarly ideas, interact with role models, and develop supportive peer networks. The example of the SAWH proves that professional associations are essential vehicles for advancement in the academic professions, particularly for women. In academia, perhaps more than in most professions, the networks provided by professional associations are often more critical to career success than internal institutional networks, especially if you're at a small place like I was. My external networks were far more important to my success. These organizations facilitate job searches, access to grant funding, publication opportunities, and lots of other external validation that's key to advancement. By skillfully negotiating its relationships with male historians in the SHA, SAWH leaders opened doors for women scholars and cultivated scholarly acceptance of the use of gender as a category of analysis. We haven't gone all the way yet, we haven't completed our work, but in the process, the women of the SAWH have enriched and broadened our understandings of our shared pasts. And I thank you. And I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
I have a couple of questions. So my first question is, so when you mentioned the smokers, the first thoughts that came to mind were images from Mad Men and also stories I heard about the formerly OHA or AHA interviews that were conducted in hotel rooms or maybe still conducted in hotel rooms. So my question is, the first question I have is, to what extent did these separate professional organizations address sexual harassment? My second question is, with the advent of the Me Too movement, do you see professional organizations focusing on barriers such as the need for comprehensive family leave, or maybe instead of scholarships for mid-career scholarships for scholars with young children? So what do you see as should be the focus in the next? So those are two separate questions.
Great questions. A lot of the pressure on all of the professional associations to develop sexual harassment policies, the OAH and the the SHA both have committees on, they call them different things, committees on diversity or minorities, and also committees on women and gender. Those have been an outgrowth of pressure from the women's organizations and the Black historical organizations. And then those committees within the SHA, for example, then advocated for and pushed for sexual harassment policies. There is continuing discussion about how much more the association needs to be doing in this Me Too era. What do we do if an officer in the organization, for example, is credibly charged with sexual harassment? Then what is the appropriate course of action for the organization? We're exploring those questions, but those are the kinds of questions that we're grappling with. The other issue, I don't think that historical organizations have done as good a job addressing some of these other issues, like the challenges facing young parents in the profession. And this actually, I chaired the SHA Committee on Women. It's now been 6 or 8 years ago. And this actually came up there, and one of the challenges was that because many of the changes that need to be made have to be made at the institutional level, and these professional organizations have limited leverage on what happens at the institutional level. And particularly, Michelle as a dean, you may want to weigh in on that, but we had trouble envisioning how the SHA could effectively advocate for that kind of change within the institution.
What about through accreditation or stuff like that? Could that be used as a carrying stick kind of?
Well, the institutional accreditation doesn't come through the professional associations. It comes through the specific accrediting organizations like the Southern Association of Colleges and Schools, which accredits most Southeastern schools, for example. So, and the professional associations don't have a lot of leverage with SAWH or any of the accrediting associations.
And the accredited associations are more interested in measuring teaching effectiveness, the student learning out, the student part of it, the student learning outcomes, and making sure that faculty have the credentials to teach the things that they're teaching. It's an interesting notion because the accredited agencies take on.
Yeah, that they have any role in improving the working conditions of the faculty. Yeah. Catherine?
I think a lot of change in all of these areas, though, comes out of protest
Yes.
and vocal. And I would, like to slightly disagree, but I don't think the sexual harassment policy and the SHA came out of the committee.
You don't think so?
No, I'm not.
And that was before my time, so I don't know.
I'm saying it came through protest at a council meeting. I'm also saying that, there are simple things like that the AHA, I think, has really stepped up to, and the OAH in the Southern hasn't yet. For example, at meetings, providing child care opportunities. And as I understand it, when I was president and brought this up, I was able to, put it through. It's a simple thing, but it takes, policy. People will then say, what about costs? What about balancing it out? And
What about
so,
liability?
But you're meeting in a hotel.
Yeah.
So you just, part of it, David, to answer is that individuals have to come forward. But it's hard on parents or graduate students coming to the meeting with kids. They're often told, well, don't be so unprofessional. Come to the meeting without your child. Put them on the bottle. I mean, this kind of stuff has been offered to people. Or bring a relative, which some of us did in the 80s, and yet some of us might not have that opportunity. The other thing to balance it out, because I've sat on many, many committees on this, and it does get to be complicated with the idea of, even among women, there are I've been on faculty committees with the notion of motherhood rather than parenthood, in the 80s, was an issue versus people who were not having children and therefore being asked within departments, within organizations to shoulder a burden. So, I think feminists still debate these issues. They're really interesting, but I think most of the time reform has come through protest. And I also say, I think it's very effective. My favorite is to go to a department meeting or a committee meeting and say, we really need to do something about this. I mean, I fear litigation. I fear what might happen. I have no fears. But the issue is, the only way to get reform and change is to threaten. But you mentioned sexual harassment. Well, right now, in the middle of amazing kinds of changes from the Department of Education. So it's been like a hairpin. It's been like a boomerang. Deans like Michelle are probably having to deal with amazing kinds of changes taking place because universities have to comply for reasons to federal policy, and federal policy is changing. I will say, though, that student protest has, in the recent years, I mean the last 2 years, done amazing things in terms of correcting a lack of policy, correcting a lack of enforcement of that policy, and putting the burden constantly on both the victim or those most vulnerable.
And that happened at one of the UCLA schools, right? I remember reading some prominent, I think, scientist was sexually harassing.
There's an astronomer, quite prominent at the university, investigated and found no reason to punish or dismiss. The organization, the National Organization of Astronomers, stepped in, as did former graduate students, as did faculty. It was interesting that the pressure was from individuals outside. And I'll be quite direct and say that it was males who were complaining about the abusive treatment of women by this particular individual. And it was only through this kind of peer pressure that these kind of things came about. So it does take men speaking out on these things as well. And I do welcome the men in these various organizations who have made it a statement. But just tooting the horn, the Cassandra Project comes out of trying to get history departments to be accountable. What are their policies? Where where can one find them? How are they distributed? What are the complaints? And the fourth is, what is the outcome of these complaints? And we hope to get this up and running. When we started it, reaching out to 140 history departments across the South, which gave advanced degrees, less than 20 replied. So we hope to use, unpleasant tactics to say, if you do not respond and give us what your stats are, what your accountability is, then we're going to have to, put it on our website that you are non-complying with good practices, which is to let applicants know, let current students know, let faculty know how they might be able to affect it. And part of it, of course, is we write directly to chairs. And I've spoken to several SAWH members who say their chairs are the least appropriate people in particular instances to raise this issue with. So we continue. And I will say, I became involved in this when I read a student post on, it was antebellum. It's now changed to sweet tea, I can't remember. It's a very good post from Southern graduate students. And they told an incident about their department, and I read it, and I thought, if things aren't changing over the past 40 years, we have to really do something about it. So it seemed that the internet and a website and a nonprofit was a really good way to launch it. So anyone interested in working on the Cassandra project, please see me after the meeting.
And to go back to a point you made earlier, it would be a mistake to think that all Southern women historians were great supporters of the SAWH, especially in the early days. And this is in the longer version of my paper and ended up on the cutting room floor, so to speak. But there were women historians, including women who were working on women's history, who felt it was a huge mistake to organize a separate organization. They felt that that was a way of ghettoizing or marginalizing women in the profession. And they were vocal critics at first. Some of them came around or became more accepting. And that was not unique to historians. There was that tension within the separate female medical societies and the separate female law associations. So there was not necessarily, it's not always pretty. And another thing that I talk about some in the larger paper is there have been tensions between historians of color and white women within the SAWH over the years. And some of that emerged at the very first conference where there was a panel on African American women's history, and there are 3 white historians presenting papers, and a black women historian commented on them, and some of those white historians got their backs up that this black woman was daring to critique how these white women had presented women's history. So, all of the same tensions that are in the larger society play out in professional organizations too. But I think they play a powerful role as vehicles for mentoring, for peer networks, for advancing careers. And certainly the SAWH has played a huge role, I think, in being a pressure organization that has over time just pushed and pushed and pushed until women have become more accepted within the SHA.
I think it's nice to see that there were early males who had lots of women graduate students and found out they worked harder.
Yeah.
They were more being out there, doing double duty. It's just so funny when you mentioned the mentoring, and I think of the difference, because some of the male mentors, I had one at the Southern who said the most important thing at the Southern was to go to the bourbon breakfast. And I wasn't much into breakfast then, and certainly wasn't into bourbon. And, it's sort of, my point being that you are being mentored, but in a way that's totally inappropriate.
Right.
To bring a young female to a breakfast
With bourbon.
Over people drinking their bourbon, not going to really advance things, but trying, and I would like to just put in that plug, but I think also you mentioned some of the supporters, that seeing John Bowles at the back of the room taking notes, really being very committed to trying. The simple things, though, of information, I kept complaining about, women not sending their articles into the Journal of Southern History, and they did a survey, and they found something very simple. which was that John was willing to put out the information. No article is submitted to the Journal of Southern History and accepted. No article is. All of them get rejected with revisions. But it was that women interpreted rejected with revisions as rejection, whereas men saw it as, oh, I have to fix this stuff and move on. So it was the language of the letter, it was the lack of knowledge that if you sent an article into the Journal of Southern History, they weren't going to accept it with revisions, they would defer it, maybe rejection is too strong. And I'm just saying, that's a good, just the information would help people. So do send your articles in to the Journal of Southern History. Get them rejected, work on them, they'll be out. But not knowing that information was so critically different because of gender. And once it was pointed out to John, he was willing to somewhat make some changes, and the board certainly reflects that.
Yeah.
The board of editors and what's appearing in the journal certainly reflects it.
Connie.
But I just was going to add some anecdotes from Cleo's Southern Sisters. One of the striking things to me in doing all the interviews and then converting them to the book was the number of Southern women historians who we interviewed who had studied with very supportive male mentors at their universities. But the men who mentored them often wanted to take on a fatherly role. So 3 or 4 of the historians talk about going in and finishing their PhD and saying, oh, and I'm now going to get married. And the PhD advisor wanted to meet the young man that these women were. And so we have come a long way from that kind of mentorship. But they were strong mentors.
Yeah.
And they really, most of them represented, did get help getting academic positions from their mentors. But you should read Cleo's Southern Sisters if you all. I hope you have it in your library, Bill, or can you get it through the Happy Trust or some other? Is it available as an Amazon book? You were talking about that you could just get books. You could get books, not through Amazon, but you were saying you could get book chapters.
Journal of Southern History, and JSTOR.
Yeah, JSTOR will now let you read book chapters. Well, this is a University of Missouri Press book. Surely JSTOR has it. But read some of those stories of becoming a woman historian in the 50s and what that meant. They're wonderful stories.
It's too sad, don't we?
Well, this one, for example, this one is great, and I cut it for time, but Arnita Jones, who studied at Emory, later went back and read some of the letters of recommendation, and she was horrified because they would have all these compliments, but one letter said, Miss Ament, now I understand that she was Dr. Ament by this point, but Miss Ament seems really quite normal, and I think would fit in easily. And they're meaning to be reassuring, but they are saying something about gender assumptions.
When Ann Scott went, to Chapel Hill with her PhD from Harvard, it was explained to her that women could not teach in the UNC department. There had been women students for 1 a year. When Mary Massey was there, another one came along. And then Oscar Hanlon wrote and kind of insisted that she be given a teaching, or recommended strongly, because they were soliciting at Harvard for a student. Well, you have one right there. Well, that student's a woman, so she can't. Well, try her. And they did. And my favorite was that the department chair sent his own child into the class to do reconnaissance on Anne, and she knew that and was quite aware. So you have to understand what level of kind of gender was going on. When I talked to women about how they wouldn't reveal their pregnancies or their children, it was because, in places like Columbia, you were fired for having children in the 1960s.
Yeah.
60s. I mean, these kinds of things are such recent history that we forget the disabilities. They're so strong.
Louise.
Connie, I wanted to tell you, I just looked it up. I know we have it as an ebook in the Arkansas State University Library.
Good.
Available as an ebook. But I also wanted to ask Melissa, or say, one of the things that I've heard over the years, and I've been a member of the SAWH for a while, but one of the things that I've heard often from Black women scholars is that they don't always feel like the organization is a place where they feel included, and they're much more inclined to be members of the Association of Black Women Historians. And so that's still an issue.
It's still an issue.
It's still an issue. I go to the breakfast and all of that sort of stuff, but I'm much more inclined to see a lot of Black women who do that kind of history at the ABWH luncheon later.
Yeah.
I wanted to share one of our early strategies from SAWH. With that wire, the women was Ben Wall, who was Secretary Treasurer of the SHA, and he was totally opposed to having women involved in any capacity in the organization. And when women began pressing about that, he said, well, they don't come to the business meetings, so they're clearly not interested. So when we heard about that at SAWH, it became a rule for the organization, for members of the organization to go to the business meeting of SHA. And I mean, we would fill the room.
Because most men don't go either.
And so he could no longer use that. And I love years later, after women had been involved in all areas of the association, most of us still going to the business meeting. I went one year, and Martha Swain and I were the only old SAWH people. I turned to Martha and I said, "Where are the women?" She said, "We won."
I just wanted to point out, because we've been talking about SAWH as being mentorship for Southern women's history, but from the very beginning, SAWH's purpose was as a networking opportunity for all women historians, many of whom were European historians.
Yes.
So Barbara Schnorrenberg,
Yes.
who was one of the founders of the organization, was a historian of 18th century Britain.
Yeah.
And from the beginning, there was a sense that across the South, probably almost more in the South than in other regions, there are these small regional colleges with faculty who there's no money for them to travel to big conferences. They can't, there's no college money to pay hotel bills in Chicago or Washington or even New Orleans, and that the SAWH became a network for women who were isolated in a Converse College or a Presbyterian college in South Carolina, and that it became a home that could bring those women a professional network opportunity within the South.
And not just people who were doing women's
That's
history.
right.
It was women who were doing history.
Yeah.
Right. And I think there's still some of that, although it focuses on women's history as a field. There is still welcoming. You can do legal history, or not. I mean, you're still welcome in that network community, and the parties are great. Carol Blesser was one of the key people who started saying we've got to raise money to have the best party that we can, because that will bring the men to our meetings.
That's right. I think there's also been a problem, though. The SHA has used women for local arrangements, raising money and doing that. We talk about that as an issue. But I would like to go back to Sharice's point. I do often talk to young Black women about their organizations and what they belong to. And I make the point that I think can be borne out statistically, that you're more likely, if you join the SAWH as a woman of color and work within that organization, to be lifted into the leadership quite quickly. We have a very strong record of that. And so I say, if you're trying to, really make a difference in an organization, that's a good place to start. And I think there shouldn't be this tension of either or. Do I belong to SHEER? because I'm so devoted to the early republic, or the Southern because I'm devoted to the Southern. And I know that, you know, in recent years, it's seen as losing leadership or a problem, but it is actually because we have such multiplicity. You know, the growth, the dramatic growth of the Black intellectual history group, which pops up and gathers in people, and that's great. But we are in times of shrinking meetings, but we do try and also say, you know, in this age of virtual and Skype meetings and everything, I think it's great to try to create a community. And I would like to say that the issue you raise is one that is always brought up at the SAWH, how to reach out and be more inclusive, and frankly, you know, it will continue to be one that one of the things I would also like to say, I learned about the Southern, I was very surprised that the Committee on Minorities came after the Committee on Women, and it was the Committee on Women who recommended it. So in some ways, it's always been, you know, the burden within the Southern organization for women to be fighting for those issues. I would also say the first Hispanic was appointed to the Committee on Minorities when there was a woman president. So there are these issues that come about through networking. Hopefully, it will keep improving.
And I think you're exactly right, because, I mean, I didn't expect to end up on the executive committee, but, you know, here I am. But I'm very glad about that. I'm very glad to be involved, and so I do tell other people, well, you know, you own some responsibility in this as well, right? You can't wait necessarily for the organization to come find you. You must find the organization.
And the most recent president of the Southern Association for Women Historians is up in a Yankee institution. So, you know, teaching at UMass, a woman of color.
Right.
I'm just pointing out that we don't hold people up geographical or
Yeah, no.
And organizations are made up of people, and they reflect all of the larger tensions in the larger society. Well, thank you all for being a great audience.